Marshall Donovan believed losing his fortune was the greatest tragedy of his life, but when betrayal stole his company, his family turned away and he found hope beside a struggling single mother named Nadine Thibodeau. He discovered that the people who save us are rarely the ones with the most money. They are the ones who refuse to leave when everything else is gone, and that one forgotten act of kindness would come back years later to rebuild not only his broken life, but the hearts of everyone who thought they had already lost everything. Marshall Osei had been sitting on the third bench in Marcus Garvey Park for 19 afternoons. He came at the same time each day and stayed until the sunlight disappeared behind the buildings. At 56, he still wore one of the expensive suits from his former life, but it no longer looked expensive. The collar was wrinkled, the jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, and the soles of his shoes were beginning to split. 6 months earlier, people had waited for him to enter conference rooms and make decisions. Now, strangers walked past him without even noticing he was there. Everything Marshall still owned could fit inside his jacket pocket. He had a key to a rented room on 125th Street, a bank card with a little over $3,000 remaining, and a folded notice reminding him that rent was due on Monday. He had enough to survive for a while, but every meal and every payment brought him closer to having nothing. The company he had spent more than 20 years building was gone. His wife had left, his son had stopped calling, and the phone in his pocket stayed silent. The hardest part was not losing the money. It was realizing that he did not know who he was when no one needed him anymore. That afternoon, the smell of fried chicken and warm cornbread drifted along the park path. Marshall heard the squeak of a damaged wheel and saw a woman pushing a food cart toward him. Her name was Nadine Thibodeau, and she had been selling meals around Harlem for 3 years. She knew the regular customers, the struggling parents, and the homeless men who tried to work for every free meal she gave them. She had seen Marshall sitting on the same bench for days, but she had never studied his face closely. When she finally did, she stopped moving. The man looked older, thinner, and completely defeated, but Nadine recognized him. 10 years earlier, he had stopped at her folding table on a New Orleans sidewalk when she had almost no money and a hungry 6-year-old daughter sitting behind her. He had bought one meal, noticed her daughter's hunger without embarrassing her, and disappeared. 3 days later, Nadine learned that someone had paid for 6 months of rent on a food stall, new kitchen equipment, and all the permits she needed to begin again. Marshall had left no address and asked for nothing in return. He had left only a handwritten note that Nadine had carried with her for the next 10 years. She pushed the cart toward the third bench and stopped in front of him. When she softly said his name, Marshall finally looked up. He studied her face, but found no memory there. Nadine opened the cart and filled a container with fried chicken, rice, beans, and a piece of cornbread. She placed it beside him without asking whether he was hungry. Marshall looked at the food, but did not touch it. "This meal is not for sale," Nadine told him. "It was paid for 10 years ago." Marshall looked at her again, trying to understand. He searched his memory for a restaurant, an employee, or a business event where they might have met, but nothing came back to him. He assumed she had recognized him from the news and was offering food out of pity. The thought made his face harden. He had lost nearly everything, but pride was one of the few things he still believed belonged to him. Nadine could see the shame behind his silence, so she did not explain further or force him to accept the meal. She turned the cart around and started down the path. After several steps, she stopped and looked back at him. "I'll pass this bench again tomorrow," she said. "I hope you'll still be here." Then she walked away, leaving Marshall alone with the unopened container. He watched her until the cart disappeared behind the trees. Part of him wanted to throw the meal away before anyone saw him accepting help. Another part of him was afraid she might not return. Marshall remained on the bench as the park slowly emptied. Children were called home, joggers disappeared through the gates, and the afternoon noise faded into the sound of traffic beyond the trees. The food was still warm beside him, and its smell made his empty stomach tighten. He had eaten only a plain roll that morning, but hunger was not the real reason he hesitated. Opening the container would mean admitting that he needed something from a stranger. It would mean accepting that the man who once provided homes and salaries for thousands of people could no longer provide one proper meal for himself. Then he remembered something his father used to say when money was tight during Marshall's childhood: pride never filled an empty stomach. Marshall finally lifted the lid. The chicken was warm, the rice had absorbed the gravy, and the cornbread smelled faintly sweet. He took the first bite slowly, still looking around to make sure no one was watching. The food tasted simple and familiar, like something prepared for a person rather than a customer. By the third bite, he could no longer pretend he had not been starving. His eyes filled with tears before he understood why. Nadine had not asked about his bankruptcy, his divorce, or the headlines that had turned his failure into public entertainment. She had not asked him to explain how a man with billions of dollars had ended up alone on a park bench. She had simply noticed that he was hungry and decided that his hunger mattered. For months, people had looked at Marshall and seen a scandal, a debt, or a fallen businessman. Nadine had looked at him and seen a human being who needed to eat. When the meal was gone, Marshall placed the empty container back inside the paper bag. A small folded note slipped from the bottom and landed beside his shoe. He picked it up and opened it beneath the fading light. Only one sentence was written inside. "Some people save us and forget. The people who were saved never do." Marshall read the words several times. He looked toward the path where Nadine had disappeared, but she was already gone. He still did not remember her, yet the note made him wonder what kind of man he had been 10 years earlier. Perhaps somewhere beneath the failure, shame, and silence, that man still existed. Marshall folded the note carefully and placed it inside his jacket beside the room key and the rent notice. For the first time in 19 days, he stood from the bench knowing exactly why he would return the next afternoon. 6 months earlier, Marshall Osei was sitting at the head of a conference table on the 32nd floor of his company's Manhattan office. 3 attorneys, 2 bank representatives, and his longtime CFO, Vernon Ashford, sat across from him. No one touched the coffee in front of them. A thick stack of loan documents had been placed beside Marshall's hand, each page marked with small yellow tabs. At first, he believed they were there to discuss a temporary cash problem. Then, one of the attorneys told him that the company owed hundreds of millions of dollars on developments he had never approved. Marshall read the first document twice. The project name sounded familiar, but the address belonged to a luxury condominium tower, not affordable housing. Another file showed money moving through companies he had never heard of. The bank representative turned to a page near the end and pointed to Marshall's signature beneath a personal guarantee. If the projects failed, the banks could seize his company, his investments, his home, and nearly everything he owned. The signature looked exactly like his. So did the signatures on dozens of other documents spread across the table. Marshall turned toward Vernon, the man who had managed his company's finances for more than 10 years. Vernon had attended family dinners, charity events, and Dorian's college graduation. Marshall had trusted him with every number he did not have time to study himself. Now, Vernon sat with both hands folded on the table, looking calm enough to discuss the weather. Marshall asked him whether the documents were real. Vernon did not deny it. He only said the company had needed to grow faster and that Marshall had never wanted to hear how much risk growth required. That was when Marshall understood the truth. Vernon had created shell companies with names that sounded like community developments, then used them to borrow money for luxury projects. He had hidden private loans inside ordinary reports and placed Marshall's signature on guarantees that tied every debt to his personal assets. The affordable housing company Marshall had built over 2 decades had become a cover for investments he never wanted. He had spent years believing he was still building homes for working families, while someone beside him was quietly hollowing the company out from the inside. By the end of the meeting, the banks had frozen the company's accounts. Employees were sent home before lunch. Security guards stood near the elevators while people carried family photographs and desk plants in cardboard boxes. Marshall remained inside his office after the floor was empty, staring at the skyline through the windows. His name was still printed on the glass door, but it no longer meant authority. It meant debt, scandal, and failure. He removed the nameplate from his desk and placed it in a drawer because he could not bear to look at it. When Marshall returned to the house that evening, Simone was waiting in the dining room. She had already spoken to her own attorney. Her laptop was open, and several documents were arranged neatly in front of her. She did not ask whether the reports were true or whether he had eaten that day. She asked how much of their property was protected by the prenuptial agreement. Marshall stood across from her and realized she had begun preparing to leave before he had even understood how badly he had been betrayed. Over the next 10 days, the house became quieter. Simone moved her clothes into the guest room and changed the passwords on several personal accounts. She took private calls behind closed doors and stopped using the word "we" when discussing the future. Marshall slept in his office because the bedroom felt like a place where he was no longer welcome. He kept hoping that once the first shock passed, they would sit down together and decide what to do. Instead, on the 11th morning, Simone placed divorce papers beside his untouched breakfast. "I cannot sink with a ship I was never allowed to steer," she told him. Marshall looked at the papers, then at the woman he had loved for 18 years. He wanted to remind her of their wedding, the years they spent raising Dorian, and the nights she had fallen asleep beside him while he worked. But the expression on her face told him those memories would not change her decision. "I am not asking you to rescue the company," he said. "I only need to know whether you can still see me now that everything around me is gone." Simone lowered her eyes. She did not answer, and the silence hurt more than the divorce papers. Marshall understood that she could see the failed businessman, the frozen accounts, and the house that might be seized. What she could no longer see was the man beneath those things. He signed nothing that morning. He simply left the room because he did not want her to watch his hands shake. Dorian arrived later that afternoon to collect several bags. He was 24, recently graduated, and still dependent on the educational trust Simone controlled. Marshall waited for his son to ask whether he had committed the fraud or whether Vernon had betrayed him. Dorian asked neither question. He packed his laptop, clothes, and framed college diploma while avoiding his father's eyes. Before leaving, he said he needed time. Marshall knew what that meant. Dorian was choosing the parent who still had access to money, stability, and a future that looked safe. That night, Marshall sent his son a long message explaining the hidden loans and forged guarantees. He deleted it before sending. He wrote a shorter message asking Dorian to call when he was ready. Dorian's reply arrived nearly an hour later. "I need time to understand what really happened." Marshall read the sentence several times. There was no anger in it, but there was no trust either. After that, Dorian stopped calling. Within weeks, Marshall lost the company, the house, and nearly every account connected to his name. He moved into a rented room with one suitcase and a phone that rarely rang. The only message he received from family came from his 82-year-old father, Eugene. It had been recorded 2 days before the company collapsed, when Eugene still believed Marshall was simply too busy to visit. The message remained unopened in Marshall's voicemail. Each night, Marshall placed his thumb over the screen and considered pressing play. He imagined his father asking when he was coming home or reminding him to eat. He imagined the pride in Eugene's voice, the pride Marshall no longer deserved. The banks could take his buildings, Simone could leave, and Dorian could stop calling. But Eugene still believed his son was a good man. That faith had become the one thing Marshall was most afraid to face. So he left the message unopened. It was easier to lose a company than to hear the voice of the last person who still believed he had not lost himself. 10 years earlier, Nadine Thibodeau was one bad week away from losing the small apartment she shared with her daughter. Each morning, she carried 2 trays of food to a sidewalk in New Orleans and set them on a folding table beneath a faded umbrella. She had no permanent stall, no employee, and no money for advertising. She only had her grandmother's recipes and the hope that enough people would stop before the food went cold. Her 6-year-old daughter, Jolene, sat behind the table with a coloring book while Nadine served customers. That afternoon, fewer people stopped than usual, and Nadine had already begun counting which bill she would leave unpaid. Jolene had eaten half a piece of toast that morning. When Nadine offered her lunch, the girl shook her head and said she was not hungry. Nadine knew it was not true, but she also knew why Jolene was lying. Every plate they ate was one less plate they could sell. Jolene kept her eyes on the coloring book, using the same 3 crayons because the others had broken. From time to time, she glanced at the trays and then quickly looked away whenever her mother turned around. Near the end of the lunch hour, a man in a dark suit stopped in front of the table. Marshall Donovan had come to New Orleans to inspect land for a new housing project, but a delayed meeting had left him walking through a neighborhood he did not know. He ordered a plate of fried chicken, rice, and beans, then remained beside the table while Nadine prepared it. She assumed he was another businessman in a hurry and handed him the food without expecting him to stay. Marshall paid, thanked her, and took 2 steps away. Then he noticed Jolene bend down behind the table. A small piece of chicken had fallen from the serving tray onto a clean sheet of foil. Jolene looked at her mother before picking it up. She held it in her fingers for a moment, as if deciding whether hunger was worth the risk of being caught. Marshall understood what he was seeing, but he did not look directly at her or call Nadine's attention to it. He returned to the table and ordered a second plate. When Nadine told him she had already given him everything he asked for, he said he had changed his mind. Marshall carried the second plate around the table and placed it near Jolene's coloring book. "I ordered too much. Would you help me finish it?" Jolene looked at her mother before touching the food. Nadine gave a small nod, though embarrassment had already reached her face. Jolene began eating slowly, taking careful bites and pushing half the chicken and cornbread to one side of the plate. Marshall asked if she did not like them. She covered the saved food with a napkin and said she wanted her mother to have some later. Marshall looked toward Nadine, who had turned away and was pretending to organize the serving spoons. He did not offer her cash or ask questions about her situation. He knew that public kindness could feel like humiliation when it forced a person to explain why they needed it. Instead, he finished his meal, placed the empty plate on the table, and asked where she would be selling the following week. Nadine pointed toward a row of permanent food stalls farther down the street and said she hoped to rent one someday. The rent was more than she could afford, and the permits and equipment would cost even more. Marshall thanked her again and left before she could ask his name. 3 days later, the owner of one of those stalls came looking for Nadine. He told her that 6 months of rent had been paid in advance under her name. A commercial fryer, a refrigerator, cooking supplies, and the required permits had also been covered. Nadine thought there had been a mistake until the owner handed her a folded piece of paper. There was no telephone number, business card, or return address inside. There was only a handwritten message. "When you are standing again, do not search for me to repay the debt. Reach for someone else who is about to fall." Nadine sat behind the folding table and read the note until the words blurred. She had spent months asking for smaller chances and being told to return when she had more money, better credit, or someone willing to guarantee her. A man who barely knew her had given her a way forward without demanding control over what came next. She placed the note inside her grandmother's recipe book between the pages for fried chicken and cornbread. Then she pulled Jolene close and told her they would remember what had happened. "Someday, we are going to do exactly what that man asked us to do." For the next 10 years, Nadine kept that promise whenever she could. She fed people who were short on money, hired workers who needed a second chance, and never threw away a meal while someone nearby was hungry. She often wondered what had happened to the man in the dark suit, but she honored his request and never searched for him. Then, one afternoon in Marcus Garvey Park, she looked toward the third bench and saw him sitting alone. This time, Marshall Donovan was the one who was about to fall. For the next 7 afternoons, Nadine pushed her cart past the third bench at the same time. She never asked Marshall whether he would be there, and he never promised to return. Still, each day she packed one extra meal before leaving home. On the first afternoon, he had refused to touch the container while she was nearby, though hunger finally defeated his pride after the park emptied. When Nadine returned the following day, she found him sitting in the same place with the folded note inside his jacket. She placed another container beside him, nodded once, and continued down the path. Marshall waited until she was gone before opening the bag. A homeless man was sleeping beneath a tree nearby, using a plastic bag as a pillow. Marshall carried the meal over and left it beside him without waking him. He told himself he was proving that he did not need Nadine's help, but the truth was less comfortable. Giving the food away allowed him to accept her kindness without admitting that it had been meant for him. Nadine saw the empty container later that evening near the tree, but she said nothing the next day. She simply brought another meal. On the third afternoon, Marshall held out the previous container before she could place the new one beside him. It had been washed and dried, though the rented room where he lived had no proper kitchen. Nadine accepted it without asking where he had cleaned it or whether he had eaten the food. Marshall expected her to praise him, thank him, or use the moment to begin a conversation. Instead, she exchanged the clean container for a full one and returned to her cart. Her silence left him with nothing to resist. By the fourth day, Marshall was already watching the path when the damaged wheel began to squeak in the distance. He straightened his jacket and pretended he had only looked up by accident. Nadine stopped long enough to leave the meal, then moved on to her regular customers. Marshall ate before the food became cold. On the fifth day, he returned the container and quietly told her the beans needed more pepper. Nadine looked at him for a moment, then said she would inform the cook. It was the closest either of them came to a joke. On the sixth afternoon, rain began before Nadine reached the park. Marshall moved beneath a tree, but he did not leave. She arrived with a plastic cover tied over the cart and handed him a meal through the falling rain. He noticed that her sleeves were wet and that she had wrapped his container twice to keep the food warm. For the first time, he wondered how far she traveled each day and how many people depended on the cart for more than lunch. He almost asked why she continued coming, but the question remained in his throat. On the seventh day, Nadine did not walk away after giving him the food. She locked the cart's wheels and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving enough space between them that Marshall did not feel trapped. He looked at the container, then at her. She did not encourage him to eat or pretend to be interested in the passing traffic. She simply waited. After a long silence, Marshall opened the lid and began eating while she was still there. Halfway through the meal, he stopped. The bite in his mouth suddenly felt too large to swallow, and he lowered the fork. Nadine did not touch him or ask what was wrong. Marshall stared at the food and tried to remember the last time someone had prepared a meal because they cared whether he ate it. At his old house, cooks had followed schedules created by assistants. At business dinners, expensive plates had been placed in front of him because contracts were being discussed. Even at home, he had often eaten while answering messages, barely noticing who sat across from him. He had paid hundreds of people over the years to cook, serve, clean, and arrange his life. Yet this woman had crossed Harlem for 7 days without knowing whether he would accept a single bite. The food was not part of a salary, a business agreement, or an effort to earn his favor. It existed only because Nadine had seen his hunger and refused to ignore it. Marshall lowered his head as his eyes filled. He was not crying over the company, the house, or the money. He was crying because a warm container of food had shown him how long he had lived without allowing anyone to care for him. "I once paid hundreds of people to prepare my meals," he said, "but this may be the first time I have felt that someone truly cared whether I ate." Nadine looked toward the cart. "I do not need your gratitude. I only need you to stop punishing yourself with hunger." Marshall wanted to tell her that hunger was not the punishment. The punishment was waking each morning with no reason to leave his room. It was keeping his father's message unopened and checking his phone, even though he knew his son would not call. Refusing food had only made that punishment visible. He picked up the fork and finished the meal, one slow bite at a time. Nadine remained beside him until the container was empty. When she stood, Marshall handed it back to her. This time, he did not look away. "Where did we meet before?" Nadine placed the container inside the cart and released the wheel lock. For a moment, he thought she might finally tell him about New Orleans, the folding table, and the hungry child hiding behind it. Instead, she studied the man on the bench as if deciding whether he was ready to recognize more than an old memory. "When you decide that you want to live again," she said, "I will tell you." Marshall watched her push the cart toward the park entrance. He had spent 6 months believing that staying alive and wanting to live were the same thing. As the squeak of the damaged wheel faded into the city noise, he began to understand that Nadine knew the difference. Chapter 4. 7 Containers of Food. For the next 7 afternoons, Nadine pushed her cart past the third bench at the same time. She never asked Marshall whether he would be there, and he never promised to return. Still, each day she packed 1 extra meal before leaving home. On the first afternoon, he had refused to touch the container while she was nearby, though hunger finally defeated his pride after the park emptied. When Nadine returned the following day, she found him sitting in the same place with the folded note inside his jacket. She placed another container beside him, nodded once, and continued down the path. Marshall waited until she was gone before opening the bag. A homeless man was sleeping beneath a tree nearby, using a plastic bag as a pillow. Marshall carried the meal over and left it beside him without waking him. He told himself he was proving that he did not need Nadine's help, but the truth was less comfortable. Giving the food away allowed him to accept her kindness without admitting that it had been meant for him. Nadine saw the empty container later that evening near the tree, but she said nothing the next day. She simply brought another meal. On the third afternoon, Marshall held out the previous container before she could place the new one beside him. It had been washed and dried, though the rented room where he lived had no proper kitchen. Nadine accepted it without asking where he had cleaned it or whether he had eaten the food. Marshall expected her to praise him, thank him, or use the moment to begin a conversation. Instead, she exchanged the clean container for a full one and returned to her cart. Her silence left him with nothing to resist. By the 4th day, Marshall was already watching the path when the damaged wheel began to squeak in the distance. He straightened his jacket and pretended he had only looked up by accident. Nadine stopped long enough to leave the meal, then moved on to her regular customers. Marshall ate before the food became cold. On the 5th day, he returned the container and quietly told her the beans needed more pepper. Nadine looked at him for a moment, then said she would inform the cook. It was the closest either of them came to a joke. On the 6th afternoon, rain began before Nadine reached the park. Marshall moved beneath a tree, but he did not leave. She arrived with a plastic cover tied over the cart and handed him a meal through the falling rain. He noticed that her sleeves were wet and that she had wrapped his container twice to keep the food warm. For the first time, he wondered how far she traveled each day and how many people depended on the cart for more than lunch. He almost asked why she continued coming, but the question remained in his throat. On the 7th day, Nadine did not walk away after giving him the food. She locked the cart's wheels and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving enough space between them that Marshall did not feel trapped. He looked at the container, then at her. She did not encourage him to eat or pretend to be interested in the passing traffic. She simply waited. After a long silence, Marshall opened the lid and began eating while she was still there. Halfway through the meal, he stopped. The bite in his mouth suddenly felt too large to swallow, and he lowered the fork. Nadine did not touch him or ask what was wrong. Marshall stared at the food and tried to remember the last time someone had prepared a meal because they cared whether he ate it. At his old house, cooks had followed schedules created by assistants. At business dinners, expensive plates had been placed in front of him because contracts were being discussed. Even at home, he had often eaten while answering messages, barely noticing who sat across from him. He had paid hundreds of people over the years to cook, serve, clean, and arrange his life. Yet this woman had crossed Harlem for 7 days without knowing whether he would accept a single bite. The food was not part of a salary, a business agreement, or an effort to earn his favor. It existed only because Nadine had seen his hunger and refused to ignore it. Marshall lowered his head as his eyes filled. He was not crying over the company, the house, or the money. He was crying because a warm container of food had shown him how long he had lived without allowing anyone to care for him. "I once paid hundreds of people to prepare my meals," he said, "but this may be the first time I have felt that someone truly cared whether I ate." Nadine looked toward the cart. "I do not need your gratitude. I only need you to stop punishing yourself with hunger." Marshall wanted to tell her that hunger was not the punishment. The punishment was waking each morning with no reason to leave his room. It was keeping his father's message unopened and checking his phone even though he knew his son would not call. Refusing food had only made that punishment visible. He picked up the fork and finished the meal, one slow bite at a time. Nadine remained beside him until the container was empty. When she stood, Marshall handed it back to her. This time, he did not look away. "Where did we meet before?" Nadine placed the container inside the cart and released the wheel lock. For a moment, he thought she might finally tell him about New Orleans, the folding table, and the hungry child hiding behind it. Instead, she studied the man on the bench as if deciding whether he was ready to recognize more than an old memory. "When you decide that you want to live again," she said, "I will tell you." Marshall watched her push the cart toward the park entrance. He had spent 6 months believing that staying alive and wanting to live were the same thing. As the squeak of the damaged wheel faded into the city noise, he began to understand that Nadine knew the difference. The weather changed so quickly that most people never saw it coming. One moment the sidewalks of Harlem were crowded with office workers heading home, parents collecting children, and vendors calling out their last orders. The next, the sky turned almost black. A sharp crack of thunder rolled across the neighborhood, followed by heavy rain that fell so fast it blurred the buildings across the street. Within minutes, people abandoned shopping bags, folded umbrellas, and rushed beneath storefront awnings. Cars splashed through growing puddles, sending sheets of water onto the sidewalks. Nadine had packed away most of her supplies, but she still needed to push the food cart 3 more blocks before reaching the small garage where she stored it each night. The damaged wheel that had squeaked through Marcus Garvey Park every afternoon suddenly caught in a storm drain, hidden beneath the rising water. Nadine pushed harder, but the cart refused to move. Rain soaked through her jacket, plastering her hair against her face. Water swirled around the wheels and climbed toward the electrical wiring beneath the cart. Worse still, the propane tank mounted along one side rocked with every desperate shove. She looked around, hoping someone might stop, but everyone nearby was running in the opposite direction, trying to escape the storm before it became dangerous. Across the street, Marshall stood beneath the narrow shelter of a closed grocery store. He had been walking back to his rented room after leaving the park when the rain forced him to stop. Through the curtain of water, he spotted the familiar cart. At first, he thought Nadine would manage on her own. Then, he saw the trapped wheel and the water climbing higher. Before he had time to think, he stepped back into the rain and ran toward her. Without saying a word, he grabbed the side of the cart beside her. Together, they pushed with everything they had. The wheel refused to budge. Marshall planted his feet against the flooded pavement while Nadine pulled from the front. With one loud scrape, the wheel finally broke free. The sudden movement threw the cart sideways, and the propane tank slipped from its metal bracket. Marshall reached out instinctively and caught it before it crashed onto the street. The hot metal fitting burned across the palm of his hand, forcing him to grit his teeth. He tightened the loose strap anyway, refusing to let go until the tank was secure. Only then did he notice something else sliding off the back shelf. A small metal box struck the edge of the cart and bounced toward the rushing water. Nearby, a canvas money bag also tumbled loose, spilling several bills into the flooded gutter. Marshall saw both at the same time. For a split second, he had to choose. He lunged after the metal box, caught it just before the current carried it beneath a parked car, and pressed it tightly against his chest. The money bag drifted several feet away before finally catching against the curb. Nadine stared at him in disbelief. Breathless, she hurried over and carefully took the metal box from his arms. Her fingers trembled as she checked the latch. When she opened it, the rain seemed to disappear from her thoughts. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic, lay her grandmother's handwritten fried chicken recipe and a folded note that had yellowed with age but remained perfectly dry. Marshall looked down at the familiar handwriting. He knew those words. He had written them. The memory did not fully return, but something deep inside him stirred. He could almost see a folding table beneath a faded umbrella. He could almost smell fresh cornbread. He could almost remember a little girl trying not to look hungry. The images slipped away before he could hold on to them, leaving only a strange ache in his chest. Nadine wiped rain and tears from her face at the same time. She held the note as carefully as if it were made of glass. "You saved the only thing I managed to carry through the hurricane," she whispered. Marshall looked at the worn paper, then at the woman standing in front of him. He wished he could remember everything she remembered. He wished he could thank her for believing in a man he was no longer sure existed. "I may not remember saving you before," he said quietly, "but tonight, I knew I couldn't let you lose something else." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The storm continued around them, but somehow it no longer felt as loud. Nadine closed the box and held it against her heart. Marshall finally noticed the burn across his hand. The skin was already turning red, and rainwater stung the fresh injury every time he moved his fingers. Nadine reached for his wrist before he could hide it. "You need to have that treated." "It's only a burn." "It's still a burn." He almost answered that he would be fine, the same lie he had been telling himself for months. Instead, he nodded. They pushed the cart the rest of the way together. The storm had begun to weaken, leaving only steady rain and quiet streets behind it. When they reached the small apartment building where Nadine lived, she unlocked the front door and motioned for him to follow. Marshall hesitated on the threshold. It had been months since anyone had invited him into a home instead of an office, a courtroom, or a bank. The warm smell of cooking greeted him before he even stepped inside. For the first time since losing everything, Marshall walked into a kitchen where someone had been waiting for him. Marshall followed Nadine into the small apartment while the last of the storm faded outside. The kitchen was modest, with old wooden cabinets, a scarred dining table, and the comforting smell of herbs that had soaked into the walls over the years. Nothing inside the room reminded him of the houses he had once owned, yet it felt more welcoming than any place he had entered since losing his company. Nadine filled a bowl with cool water and quietly cleaned the burn on his hand. She worked carefully, wrapping fresh gauze around his palm before placing a cup of hot tea in front of him. Neither of them felt the need to rush the silence. When the bandage was secure, Nadine walked to a cabinet and removed an old recipe book. Its cover had faded with time, and several pages had been repaired with tape after years of use. She opened it slowly until she reached the middle. Folded between two stained pages rested the handwritten note Marshall had given her 10 years earlier. She placed the book on the table and began telling him the story he had long forgotten. She spoke about the folding table on a quiet New Orleans sidewalk where every customer meant another meal for her daughter. She remembered the afternoon Marshall noticed 6-year-old Jolene pretending she was not hungry. Instead of embarrassing the little girl, he quietly bought another plate and invited her to help him finish it. 3 days later, someone had paid 6 months of rent for a permanent food stall, purchased the equipment, covered the permits, and disappeared without leaving a phone number or expecting thanks. The only thing left behind was the note now resting between the pages of her grandmother's recipe book. As Nadine spoke, forgotten images drifted through Marshall's mind. A little girl holding back her appetite, the smell of fried chicken on a hot afternoon, a woman trying to smile while hiding her fear. The memories were incomplete, like pieces of a photograph damaged by time, but they were enough for him to recognize the handwriting on the note. He had written those words. What stunned him most was not what he had done. It was discovering that a decision he barely remembered had become the foundation of another family's life. The food cart, the apartment, Jolene's education, and every meal Nadine now served to strangers, all traced back to one afternoon he had almost forgotten. For months, Marshall had measured his life by everything he had lost. Sitting in that small kitchen, he realized he had overlooked the only investment that had never disappeared. His company had collapsed. His wealth had vanished. Yet one quiet act of kindness had continued growing long after the buildings carrying his name were gone. He lowered his eyes and spoke more honestly than he had with anyone since his world fell apart. "I helped you stand again, yet when I fell, I did not know how to rise." Nadine gently closed the recipe book. Strength does not mean never falling. Sometimes strength means allowing another person to take your hand. Her words settled over the room. Marshall looked at the fresh bandage on his hand and finally understood that the injury was not the reason he had come into this kitchen. For 6 months, he had refused every offer of help because accepting it felt like surrender. Now, he began to see that refusing help had only kept him trapped inside his own shame. His phone rested inside his jacket pocket. There was still one thing he had avoided longer than hunger, loneliness, or failure: the unopened voicemail from his father. Nadine noticed him staring at the phone but said nothing. She simply gave him the quiet space to make the choice himself. After several long moments, Marshall unlocked the screen and pressed play. An elderly voice filled the kitchen. "Son, do not spend the rest of your life trying to prove that you are still the man you used to be. Find one good thing you can still do today." Marshall closed his eyes. He listened to the message again, then a third time. Each replay stripped away another layer of guilt he had carried since the company collapsed. He no longer saw the courtroom, the frozen bank accounts, or the headlines calling him a fraud. He saw his father repairing broken pipes after long days of work, always believing that no problem was solved by standing still. Eugene had never measured a person's worth by success. He measured it by what they chose to do when life became difficult. Marshall placed the phone on the table. His shoulders began to shake as months of buried grief finally broke free. He covered his face with both hands and cried without trying to hide it. Nadine remained beside him, saying nothing. Some pain did not need advice. It only needed someone willing to stay. The following morning, Harlem was still dark when Nadine unlocked the garage where she kept her food cart. She expected to be alone. Instead, Marshall was already waiting outside. It was 5 o'clock. He was wearing the same worn suit, his bandaged hand tucked inside his coat pocket. He carried no briefcase, no business plan, and no expectation of being paid. The man who had once employed thousands had come only to offer the one thing he still possessed: his time. When Nadine raised the garage door, Marshall looked at her with quiet determination. "I need one good thing to do today." Marshall arrived before sunrise every morning. Nadine never gave him special treatment simply because he had once built a billion-dollar company. On his first day, she handed him an apron, pointed toward the fryer, and told him to start with the chicken. Within 20 minutes, the first batch was burned beyond saving. Trying to recover, Marshall mixed up 3 customer orders, sending the wrong meals to the wrong people. When he hurried to fix the mistake, he knocked over an entire container of homemade sauce, covering part of the floor in thick brown gravy. Several customers smiled politely, while Marshall wished the ground would swallow him. Years earlier, he had managed thousands of employees without raising his voice. Now, he could not even survive one busy breakfast rush. Nadine didn't comfort him or remind everyone who he used to be. She quietly handed him a mop, pointed to the spilled sauce, and waited. After the floor was clean, she showed him how to filter the cooking oil without wasting it. When another mistake happened, she made him prepare the order again, instead of fixing it herself. By the end of the morning, Marshall's back ached, his shoes smelled like grease, and his bandaged hand stung every time he lifted the fryer basket. Yet something inside him felt lighter than it had in months. Every mistake had an immediate solution. There were no lawyers, no court hearings, and no newspaper headlines. If he burned the chicken, he simply cooked another batch. If he spilled the sauce, he cleaned it up and kept working. Around lunchtime, the cart became quiet for a while. A teenage girl walked over carrying a backpack filled with textbooks and notebooks. Marshall recognized her immediately from the old photographs hanging inside Nadine's apartment. Jolene had grown into a confident 16-year-old, but the warm smile she gave her mother was exactly the same. After helping serve a few customers, she spread several worksheets across a small folding table beside the cart. She sighed, erased half a page of calculations, and started over again. Nadine smiled as she prepared another order. "School project," she explained. "She has to build a budget for a small business. Expenses, profit, pricing. She's been stuck on it for 2 days." Marshall glanced toward the papers. Columns of numbers filled the page, but the calculations wandered in circles. Jolene understood math well enough. What confused her was how real businesses actually worked. She needed to decide how much money came in, how much went out, and whether anything remained after paying for ingredients, rent, equipment, and supplies. Marshall looked around for a notebook, but found only one of the brown paper bags they used for takeout orders. He turned it over, picked up a marker, and began drawing simple boxes connected by arrows. Instead of talking about complicated accounting, he started with the food cart standing beside them. Every sale became one small stream of income. Every bag of flour, bottle of oil, propane refill, permit, and repair became an expense. He showed her why selling more meals meant very little if costs kept growing faster than revenue. Then he explained how even a small profit, protected and managed carefully, could slowly build something much larger. The paper bag filled with circles, numbers, and short notes until the lesson looked more like a conversation than a school assignment. Jolene studied the drawing for several minutes before her expression suddenly changed. "I get it now." She grabbed her calculator and checked the numbers again. This time, everything balanced. The confusion that had frustrated her for days disappeared in less than 15 minutes. She laughed softly, folded the paper bag with surprising care, and slipped it inside one of her notebooks as though it were more valuable than the printed worksheets. Marshall watched her excitement and felt an unexpected ache in his chest. He realized he had never done this with Dorian. He had paid for the finest schools, private tutors, summer programs, and every opportunity money could buy. Whenever his son struggled with homework, Marshall usually hired another expert instead of sitting down beside him. He had convinced himself he was giving Dorian the very best future possible. Looking back, he understood that what his son often needed most was not another teacher. He needed his father. Marshall lowered his eyes. "I spent years protecting my son's future, but I missed most of his childhood." The words hung quietly between them. Jolene looked at him for a moment before closing her notebook. She had heard enough stories from her mother to know that regret could either become another prison or the beginning of something better. She spoke gently, without trying to make his pain disappear. "Then you still have time to become his father again. You just cannot keep waiting for him to come first." Marshall looked toward the steady flow of people walking through the park. Somewhere in the city, Dorian was living his own life, believing too much time had already passed between them. For the first time, Marshall wondered whether both of them had been waiting for the other to make the first move. He folded another paper bag and slipped it into his apron pocket. Perhaps rebuilding a relationship was not so different from rebuilding a business. Someone simply had to begin with the first small step. Several weeks passed, and Marshall gradually settled into a life that felt completely different from the one he had known before. His mornings began before sunrise at Nadine's food cart, and his evenings ended with sore muscles instead of endless meetings. The simple routine gave him something he had not felt in a long time, a reason to wake up each day. One evening, after they finished cleaning the grill and locking away the supplies, they remained seated outside the garage while the neighborhood grew quiet around them. Marshall stared at the empty street for a long time before finally admitting there was something he had never told anyone. When his company collapsed, he had managed to save one backup of the financial records on an old portable hard drive. He had never opened it again, not because he believed it could restore his reputation, but because throwing it away would have felt like erasing the last piece of the life he had spent more than 20 years building. Nadine listened without interrupting. She had learned that Marshall usually spoke only after carrying his thoughts for a long time, so she let him finish before suggesting they visit someone she trusted. The following afternoon, she closed the cart earlier than usual and drove him to a small office tucked between a neighborhood pharmacy and an old barber shop. A weathered brass sign identified the owner as Clarence Abrams, a semi-retired attorney and forensic accountant who still accepted a few cases each year. His office looked more like a study than a law firm, with shelves overflowing with legal books, tax manuals, and worn case files collected over decades. As soon as Marshall introduced himself, Clarence paused for a moment, studying his face before a warm smile slowly appeared. "You do not remember my family, but one of your buildings gave my mother a place where she could grow old without fearing eviction." Marshall searched his memory but found nothing. That no longer surprised him. Since meeting Nadine, he had discovered that some of the most meaningful things he had done were the ones he had completely forgotten. Clarence explained that his mother had spent nearly 20 years living in one of Marshall's first affordable housing developments after losing her husband. The rent had remained fair, the building had been well maintained, and for the first time in years, she no longer worried about being forced out of her home. Clarence admitted that his mother had spoken of Marshall with gratitude until the day she died, even though the two had never met. Hearing those words left Marshall speechless. He had spent months believing the world remembered him only as a disgraced businessman, yet the people whose lives he had quietly improved still remembered a very different man. Marshall placed the old hard drive on Clarence's desk, uncertain whether it still contained anything useful. Clarence connected it to his computer and began opening folders one by one with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime following financial trails. At first, everything appeared ordinary. There were budgets, project reports, audit summaries, and thousands of routine transactions that looked exactly as Marshall remembered them. But Clarence never focused only on the summaries. Instead, he compared timestamps, original spreadsheets, archived emails, and hidden versions of the same reports. Nearly 2 hours passed before he finally leaned back in his chair, narrowed his eyes, and quietly reopened several files that seemed unrelated. The deeper Clarence searched, the clearer the pattern became. Millions of dollars had been transferred through a network of shell companies whose names meant nothing on their own, but formed a carefully designed chain when viewed together. Funds disappeared from affordable housing projects, passed through consulting firms that existed only on paper, and eventually resurfaced in luxury developments completely unrelated to Marshall's business. Even more disturbing, the reports Marshall had personally reviewed during board meetings were not the original reports stored in the system. Key transactions had been removed, financial summaries had been rewritten, and supporting documents had been replaced before the files ever reached his desk. Marshall stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing that many of the decisions he had made were based on information someone had deliberately altered long before he ever saw it. Clarence folded his arms, studying the evidence one last time before turning toward Marshall. A failed business usually leaves ashes. A theft this large leaves footprints. The room became silent again. For the first time since his company collapsed, Marshall felt something stronger than regret. He was beginning to believe the truth had never completely disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath years of carefully constructed lies. Clarence continued searching through the remaining folders until one directory refused to open. Unlike every other file on the drive, this one was protected by encryption and identified only by two simple letters. Dio Marshall felt the blood drain from his face. Those were not random initials. They belonged to his son. As he stared at the locked folder, one question echoed through his mind. Had Dorian been protecting the truth, or had someone wanted him to become part of the lie? Clarence spent the next hour examining the encrypted folder from every angle he legally could. He checked file dates, metadata, and system logs, hoping one of them would reveal a clue about the password. Nothing worked. The encryption was strong enough that forcing it open would take far longer than any of them could afford. Leaning back in his chair, Clarence finally reached the simplest conclusion. Whoever created the folder had never expected a stranger to unlock it. The password was probably not a random string of numbers, but something deeply personal, something only a handful of people would recognize. Marshall nodded slowly and began trying every family memory that came to mind. Dorian's birthday was rejected immediately. The name of his first elementary school failed as well. Even the name of the golden retriever Dorian had loved as a child brought the same message across the screen: incorrect password. Each failed attempt seemed to erase another piece of Marshall's confidence. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the monitor, searching for memories that had grown distant after years of endless business trips and late-night meetings. Clarence advised him to stop before the system locked them out completely, explaining that guessing blindly would only make things worse. Marshall agreed, but he could not hide the disappointment on his face. The folder was sitting only inches away, yet it felt farther than ever. It was becoming painfully clear that the answer was not hidden inside financial records. It was hidden somewhere in a relationship he had allowed to slowly drift apart. Nadine had watched the entire process without saying much. She understood that Marshall was no longer fighting a technical problem. He was facing the consequences of years spent putting work ahead of family. Quietly, she picked up his phone from the desk and placed it in front of him. Marshall looked at the screen without touching it, already knowing who she wanted him to call. The silence stretched across the room until Nadine finally spoke. "You may lose a legal case if you do not make this call. But what frightens me more is that you may lose your son because both of you are waiting for the other person to speak first." Marshall kept his eyes on the phone for several seconds before taking a slow breath. During the month since everything had fallen apart, he had imagined dozens of conversations with Dorian, yet he had never found the courage to make the first call. Part of him feared hearing anger. Another part feared hearing nothing at all. Today, for the first time, those fears seemed smaller than the possibility of losing his son forever. He pressed the call button and listened as the phone rang once, then twice, then a third time. The line finally connected. Neither of them spoke at first. Marshall could hear faint traffic in the background, followed by the quiet sound of his son breathing on the other end. It was a silence filled with years of misunderstandings, disappointment, and words that had never been spoken. When Dorian finally broke it, his voice carried more exhaustion than anger. "I do not know whose side I'm supposed to be on." Marshall closed his eyes. He realized his son had spent months watching news reports, legal accusations, and endless speculation without knowing what was true anymore. He could have defended himself. He could have blamed Vernon, the board, or the media. Instead, he chose the one answer that mattered most. "I am not asking you to stand on my side. I am asking you to stand beside the truth." The words hung quietly between them. Dorian did not answer right away, but Marshall sensed something had changed. For the first time in months, they were no longer speaking as a disgraced executive and the son caught in the middle of a public scandal. They were simply a father and his child trying to find their way back to each other. After another long pause, Dorian spoke more softly. He admitted that the initials on the folder had reminded him of something from years ago. When he was 5, He and his father had spent an entire Saturday at the park after one of Marshall's rare weekends away from work. Together, they had folded a paper boat from an old newspaper and floated it across a small pond. Before setting it on the water, they had given it a name, laughing as though it were the greatest ship ever built. Dorian confessed he had almost forgotten that afternoon because so many busy years had followed, but hearing his father's voice had suddenly brought the memory back with surprising clarity. Marshall felt his own memories returning at the same time. He smiled for the first time that day and slowly typed the name of the paper boat into the password field. Everyone in the room held their breath. A soft click came from the computer. The encrypted folder opened. Clarence immediately began scanning the files inside, while Marshall stood frozen beside the desk. The first recordings captured Vernon's voice, discussing hidden money transfers through shell companies and explaining how the altered reports would never reach Marshall's office. Additional documents revealed digital signatures authorizing the movement of private assets into protected accounts. Every signature belonged to Simone. The evidence did not answer every question, but it confirmed something far more important. Marshall had not imagined the betrayal. Someone had carefully built it over years, believing the truth would remain locked away forever. Marshall looked at the open folder, then back at the phone still resting in his hand. They had recovered the evidence they needed, but the greatest breakthrough of the evening had not been opening a computer file. It had been opening the first honest conversation between a father and his son. Dorian arrived in Harlem the following evening, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of tailored coat that had once filled Marshall's own closet. Expensive shoes clicked softly against the worn wooden steps leading to Nadine's apartment, but every confident detail about his appearance disappeared the moment the door opened. The apartment was small, warm, and filled with the smell of freshly cooked food. Family photographs covered one wall, and the old recipe book rested on the kitchen counter beside a basket of bread. Dorian looked around awkwardly, as though he had entered a world completely different from the one he had grown up in. Nadine greeted him with quiet kindness before leaving the father and son alone at the kitchen table. Between them sat the portable hard drive, Clarence's printed reports, and a plate of fried chicken that neither of them had touched. The food had already grown cold, but neither man seemed to notice. For several minutes, they focused on the documents instead of each other. Clarence had organized the evidence carefully, highlighting the hidden transfers, altered reports, and recorded conversations that connected Vernon to the missing money. Dorian read every page without interruption, occasionally stopping to compare dates or replay one of the recordings. The deeper he looked, the more his expression changed. The confidence he had carried into the apartment slowly gave way to disbelief, followed by guilt that became impossible to hide. Marshall watched quietly from across the table. He wanted answers, but he also understood that forcing them too quickly would only build another wall between them. This conversation had been delayed for months. It deserved the patience both of them had failed to show each other in the past. When Dorian finally placed the last document on the table, he kept his eyes lowered for a long time before speaking. He admitted that after the investigation became public, Simone had insisted there was only one safe choice. She warned him that every conversation with Marshall could be used against the family, and that staying close to his father would destroy everything they had worked for. She also reminded him that the educational trust paying for his future remained under her control and could be frozen if he openly challenged her decisions. At the time, he had convinced himself that waiting was the responsible thing to do. He believed the truth would eventually reveal itself without forcing him to choose between his parents. Instead, every day of silence pushed him farther away from the father who needed him most. Tears gathered in Dorian's eyes as the weight of those months finally caught up with him. I chose the place where my future seemed safest, but since that day, I have not been able to look at myself without feeling ashamed. Marshall listened without interrupting. Part of him wanted to reach across the table and tell his son everything would be all right. Another part remembered the empty hospital room after Eugene's funeral, the unanswered phone calls, and the countless nights he had wondered whether Dorian had stopped believing in him. Love made forgiveness possible, but it did not erase pain overnight. If they were going to rebuild their relationship, it had to begin with honesty instead of pretending nothing had happened. He looked directly at his son before answering. "I understand why you were afraid, but understanding your fear does not erase what it did to me." The words settled heavily between them. Dorian nodded slowly because he knew they were true. Neither of them tried to defend the past any longer. There was no argument left to win, no excuse capable of undoing the choices that had already been made. Outside, the sounds of Harlem drifted through the open kitchen window, reminding them that life beyond the apartment had continued while they spent months trapped by silence. Inside, however, something had begun to change. For the first time since the collapse, they were no longer hiding behind lawyers, headlines, or other people's opinions. They were speaking honestly, even when the truth hurt. After a long silence, Marshall reached for the untouched plate of food resting between them. The fried chicken had gone cold hours earlier, and the cornbread was no longer warm. Yet he quietly divided the meal into 2 equal portions and slid one plate across the table. It was a simple gesture, almost ordinary, but Dorian understood what it meant. His father was not offering instant forgiveness. He was offering a place at the table. Without another word, they began eating together. The food was cold, but neither of them complained. Some meals were never remembered for their taste. They were remembered because they marked the beginning of something that had almost been lost forever. When they finished, Dorian looked once more at the evidence spread across the table. He knew what the recordings and financial records would mean once they reached the authorities. Testifying against Vernon and supporting his father's case would almost certainly destroy the inheritance that had shaped his future since childhood. The decision frightened him, but for the first time, fear no longer felt like the strongest voice in the room. He gathered the files into his briefcase, looked at his father, and quietly promised that when the investigation reached court, he would tell the truth exactly as he now understood it, no matter what it cost him. Marshall gave a small nod, saying nothing more. The road back to being father and son was still long, but that night, 3 people had sat around a small kitchen table, shared a cold meal, and taken the first real step toward becoming a family again. The dinner crowd had finally disappeared, leaving the sidewalks quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional subway train beneath the streets. Marshall and Nadine worked side by side, wiping down the counters and packing away the last containers of food, while Jolene swept the pavement around the cart. It had become a familiar routine, one that brought a sense of peace Marshall had not expected to find. Just as Nadine locked the cash drawer, a black luxury sedan pulled slowly to the curb. The engine remained running as a man stepped out, his tailored suit untouched by the humid summer air. Vernon looked exactly as he had during the final years of the company, calm, polished, and completely in control. He smiled as though he were greeting an old colleague instead of the man whose life had been destroyed. Marshall said nothing, while Vernon approached the cart, carrying a slim leather folder. Nadine immediately sensed something was wrong and quietly guided Jolene toward the back of the trailer to finish organizing supplies. Vernon placed the folder on the serving counter and opened it with practiced confidence. Inside was a settlement agreement prepared by one of the city's most prestigious law firms. If Marshall signed the document, he would publicly confirm that every investment decision made by the company had been lawful and fully authorized by him. In return, Vernon promised a financial settlement large enough to rebuild his life, cover every legal expense, and allow him to disappear from the investigation with dignity. The offer sounded less like an apology than a carefully calculated business transaction. Marshall slowly turned the pages without speaking. The amount of money printed near the end of the agreement would have solved nearly every financial problem he faced. It could have paid his debts, given him a new home, and erased months of uncertainty. Yet every paragraph demanded the same price. His signature would permanently bury the evidence Clarence had uncovered and transform years of deception into an official version of history. Vernon watched him closely, believing the temptation would eventually outweigh his conscience. After all, he had spent decades convincing himself that every person had a price. He simply needed to find the number. Then Vernon's expression changed. Seeing that Marshall still had not reached for the pen, he quietly revealed the reason he had come in person instead of sending another lawyer. Months earlier, while restructuring company assets, forged documents had been created to place Eugene's apartment inside a complicated chain of collateral agreements connected to several fraudulent loans. On paper, the property no longer stood alone. If the ongoing investigation moved forward and the financial network collapsed, the apartment could legally become part of the assets seized by creditors. Vernon calmly explained that Marshall still had time to prevent it. One signature would make the investigation disappear, protect the apartment, and ensure that Eugene could continue living in the home where he had spent more than 50 years. Marshall felt his hand tighten around the agreement. For a brief moment, every lesson his father had taught him collided with every instinct telling him to protect the man who had sacrificed everything for his family. Eugene was elderly, and that small apartment held an entire lifetime of memories. Saving it should have been the easiest decision in the world. All Marshall had to do was sign his name. Yet he knew exactly what would follow. Vernon would walk away untouched, innocent people would never learn the truth, and every family harmed by the fraud would be left carrying a burden they did not deserve. The paper in his hands suddenly felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed during his years as a businessman. Nadine had remained silent throughout the conversation, but now she stepped beside Marshall and looked at the agreement resting in his hands. She remembered the stranger who had once helped her without asking for anything in return, the man whose kindness had allowed her daughter to build a future instead of merely surviving. She refused to watch that same man surrender the values that had made him who he was. "You helped me without asking me to sell my dignity. Do not save your father by becoming someone he would no longer recognize." Marshall closed the folder. His decision was made before he even realized it. Without another word, he handed the agreement back across the counter. For the first time that evening, Vernon's calm expression cracked. The confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and courtrooms gave way to quiet frustration. He warned Marshall that refusing the offer would bring consequences far beyond financial ruin. Then he picked up the folder, turned toward the waiting sedan, and disappeared into the night, convinced he had delivered one final threat that would eventually force Marshall to surrender. What Vernon never noticed was the small phone resting behind a stack of supply boxes near the back of the cart. While organizing the shelves, Jolene had quietly activated the voice recorder the moment she recognized Vernon's voice. She had captured every offer, every threat, and every attempt to pressure Marshall into destroying the evidence. When the car disappeared around the corner, she walked back to the front of the cart, holding the phone with both hands. Clarence listened to the recording later that night without interrupting. When it ended, he looked at Marshall with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since the investigation began. The evidence hidden inside the encrypted folder had revealed how the fraud was committed. This recording revealed something just as important. It proved that Vernon was still trying to silence the truth. Marshall left Harlem early the next morning, carrying only a small paper bag and the weight of everything Vernon had said the night before. The subway ride to Brooklyn felt longer than usual as he replayed the conversation again and again, wondering whether he had made the right choice. Part of him still questioned whether he should have signed the agreement to protect his father's apartment, even if it meant burying the truth forever. By the time he reached the familiar neighborhood where he had grown up, the streets were already busy with people beginning their day. Eugene's apartment building looked exactly as Marshall remembered it. The bricks had faded with age, the front steps showed years of wear, and the small flower boxes beneath the windows were still carefully maintained by the tenants. Nothing about the building suggested it had become another piece in a complicated financial scheme. To Marshall, It was simply home. A visiting nurse quietly let him inside before leaving them alone. Eugene was sitting near the window wrapped in a light blanket, watching children walk to school across the street. The minor stroke had weakened him more than Marshall expected. His right hand trembled slightly, and the words he tried to form came slowly, often fading before they became clear. Yet the warmth in his eyes had not changed. Marshall pulled a chair beside him and tried to smile, but the effort lasted only a few seconds before the truth overwhelmed him. He admitted everything he had been carrying for months. He spoke about the company that no longer existed, the marriage that had fallen apart, the distance between himself and Dorian, and the investigation that continued to uncover new betrayals. Finally, his voice grew quieter as he confessed the fear that had followed him since meeting Vernon. Because of the forged documents, even the apartment where Eugene had spent more than 50 years might soon be taken away. Marshall lowered his head, unable to hide the shame that still haunted him. For a long moment, Eugene simply watched his son without judgment. He made no attempt to interrupt or shake his head in disappointment. Instead, he slowly reached toward the small wooden table beside his chair and opened the top drawer. Inside were dozens of neatly folded papers that Marshall immediately recognized. They were old savings receipts from years of plumbing work, carefully kept even though most people would have thrown them away long ago. Beneath them rested a pair of faded leather work gloves, their fingers worn smooth after decades of repairing pipes, fixing broken heaters, and crawling beneath old houses. Eugene placed both items on the table before searching for a pen. His hands shook as he wrote slowly across the back of one of the receipts, pausing several times to steady the paper before finally pushing it toward his son. A house is not what keeps people together. Love is. Marshall read the sentence twice before his vision blurred. All those years he had believed success meant building larger developments, taller buildings, and stronger companies. He had measured his worth by the number of families he could house, never realizing that his own family had quietly drifted apart while he chased one project after another. The words written by his father carried no anger, no accusation, and no disappointment. They offered only the simple truth Eugene had lived by his entire life. Marshall could no longer hold back the emotions he had buried for months. He slid from the chair onto one knee beside his father's seat, lowered his head, and rested it gently against Eugene's knees, exactly as he had done as a frightened little boy after difficult days at school. For the first time since childhood, he allowed himself to feel like a son instead of a man expected to solve every problem alone. I built thousands of homes, but I allowed my own family to lose its way back to one another. Eugene could not answer with clear words. Instead, he slowly lifted both trembling hands and rested them on Marshall's head. The gesture was weak, almost fragile, yet it carried more comfort than anything Marshall had heard since the company collapsed. It reminded him of evenings long ago when his father returned home exhausted from work, still finding enough strength to reassure his son that every difficult day eventually came to an end. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. The silence between them was no longer filled with regret. It was filled with understanding. When it was finally time to leave, Marshall helped his father back into his chair and reached for his coat. Before he could walk away, Eugene pointed once more toward the old work gloves lying on the table. Marshall hesitated, unsure why they mattered, until his father gently pushed them into his hands. The leather was cracked, the stitching had been repaired more than once, and traces of old paint still marked the fingertips. They were worth almost nothing, yet Marshall understood immediately what they represented. His father had built an honest life with those gloves. Every meal, every school uniform, every birthday gift, and every sacrifice had begun with the work of those aging hands. Marshall folded the gloves carefully and placed them inside his jacket pocket, promising himself he would carry them wherever life took him next. As he reached the apartment door, he turned back one last time. Eugene was still sitting by the window, watching him with the same quiet pride that had followed him since childhood. Marshall smiled, and Eugene returned the smile as best he could. Neither of them knew that this ordinary goodbye would become the final time they would ever look into each other's eyes. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, Clarence delivered the financial records recovered from Marshall's hard drive along with the audio recording Jolene had captured behind the food cart. Federal investigators spent hours reviewing the altered reports, comparing timestamps, tracing shell companies, and matching Vernon's recorded conversations with the hidden transfers buried inside the accounting system. The evidence no longer pointed to isolated mistakes or poor business decisions. It revealed a pattern that had been carefully built over several years. Before long, Vernon received an official summons to appear before investigators. Dorian also agreed to testify, confirming that his father had never seen the original financial reports and had no knowledge of the hidden accounts created behind his back. For the first time since the company collapsed, the investigation was no longer centered on proving Marshall's guilt. It was beginning to uncover who had benefited from keeping him in the dark. The evening before the hearing, Marshall received an unexpected message asking him to meet Simone at a quiet cafe a few blocks away from the courthouse. She arrived alone, dressed as elegantly as ever, yet the confidence that had once defined her seemed noticeably thinner. Dark circles beneath her eyes hinted at weeks of sleepless nights, and the untouched cup of coffee in front of her had already gone cold. She did not waste time speaking about lawyers or public statements. Instead, she asked Marshall to stop Dorian from testifying. She admitted that once their son appeared before investigators, there would be no way to protect the future she had spent years trying to secure for him. The family trust could collapse, his inheritance could disappear, and every opportunity she had planned for him might vanish overnight. "You may hate me, but do not let our son destroy his future." Marshall listened quietly before answering. Months earlier, those words might have shaken him. Now, after everything he had learned, he understood that protecting Dorian meant something very different from preserving money or status. He thought about Nadine's food cart, Eugene's worn work gloves, and the paper boat whose name had opened the encrypted folder. None of those memories had any financial value, yet together they had become the foundation of everything he was trying to rebuild. A future is not destroyed by telling the truth. It is destroyed when a person learns how to live comfortably inside a lie. Simone lowered her eyes. For the first time, she stopped defending herself and simply spoke as a woman exhausted by the consequences of her own choices. She admitted that Vernon had handled much of the family's financial planning for years and had assured her that moving assets into separate accounts was simply a precaution against business risks. She knew some of the transactions looked unusual, and more than once she had considered asking difficult questions. Instead, she chose to believe the explanations because they protected the comfortable life she wanted to preserve. She insisted she had never planned the fraud or understood how far Vernon had gone, but she could no longer deny the truth that mattered most. Every warning sign had been there. She had seen enough to know something was wrong, yet she deliberately looked away because discovering the truth might have forced her to sacrifice the life she enjoyed. As those words left her mouth, Marshall realized she was not asking for forgiveness. She was finally admitting the failure she had spent months trying to avoid. The next morning, reporters gathered outside the federal building long before the hearing began. Cameras lined the sidewalks while lawyers, investigators, and witnesses quietly passed through the security entrance. Dorian stood near the front steps wearing a dark suit that made him look older than his years. In his hand was a folder containing the statement he had rewritten several times during the previous night. He looked toward the entrance, then back at his father. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He knew that once he testified, Simone could remove him from the family trust, and everything he had expected to inherit might disappear. The future he had once believed was guaranteed now depended entirely on the choice he was about to make. Before walking through the courthouse doors, Dorian turned to Marshall one last time. "This time, I am not choosing the person with the most money. I am choosing the person I want to become." Marshall said nothing. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, knowing that no speech could make the moment more meaningful. Together they walked toward the entrance, no longer as a disgraced businessman and the son caught between two parents, but as two men willing to face whatever came next with the truth on their side. Behind them, television cameras continued searching for another corporate scandal. Ahead of them, inside the hearing room, the first sworn testimony was about to begin, and for the first time since everything fell apart, Marshall no longer feared what the truth might reveal. The hearing changed everything. Within days, investigators expanded their case, additional financial records were seized, and Vernon found himself answering questions he could no longer avoid. Simone was never charged with organizing the fraud, but her connection to the protected assets and the documents bearing her digital signature placed her under intense professional scrutiny. The law firm where she had spent years building her reputation announced that she was being suspended while the investigation continued. Clients quietly transferred their cases elsewhere. Invitations to charity events stopped arriving. Colleagues who had once praised her judgment suddenly became impossible to reach. The people who had filled her calendar for years disappeared with surprising speed, reminding her that many of those relationships had depended more on success than loyalty. For the first time in her adult life, silence became the loudest sound inside her apartment. Several weeks later, Simone's birthday arrived without celebration. She woke out of habit, dressed neatly, and prepared dinner exactly as she had done every year during happier times. She cooked Marshall's favorite roasted chicken, made the mashed potatoes Dorian had loved since childhood, and baked a small chocolate cake using the same family recipe she had followed for years. Before sitting down, she carefully placed 3 plates on the dining table. One was set in front of her own chair. Another remained where Dorian had always sat. The third stayed across the table, where Marshall used to smile after long days at work before life became consumed by meetings and deadlines. When everything was ready, she looked toward the apartment door without realizing she was holding her breath. Minutes passed, then an hour. The food slowly cooled, but the silence never changed. No footsteps echoed in the hallway, no key turned in the lock. The birthday she had imagined sharing with her family became another evening spent listening to an empty apartment. As darkness settled outside the windows, Simone reached for her phone. She stared at Marshall's name for a long time before gathering enough courage to press the call button. She did not expect him to come back. Too much had happened for that. She no longer believed one conversation could repair years of broken trust. There was only one question she had carried through every sleepless night since the hearing ended, a question that mattered more to her than the investigation, the suspended career, or the fortune she might never recover. "Have you finally stopped hating me?" Marshall stood outside Nadine's apartment while the phone rested against his ear. He could hear the quiet loneliness in Simone's voice, and for a moment he remembered the young woman he had fallen in love with long before success complicated their lives. Hatred had once consumed him after the collapse of his company and the loss of his family. But somewhere between Nadine's food cart, Eugene's quiet wisdom, and Dorian's decision to tell the truth, that anger had slowly faded. What remained was something calmer and far more honest. He realized he had spent years hoping Simone would become someone willing to value truth above comfort, family above status, and integrity above security. Accepting that she had made different choices did not erase the pain, but it finally allowed him to stop carrying expectations that would never be fulfilled. "I stopped waiting for you to become someone you never chose to be." For several seconds, Simone said nothing. She understood that his words were not spoken with bitterness. They were spoken with acceptance. Marshall did not accuse her, demand an apology, or remind her of everything she had lost. He simply told her that every person eventually becomes the result of the choices they are willing to make. Before ending the call, he quietly wished her enough courage to face those choices honestly, because no court, no lawyer, and no amount of money could do that work for her. It was the gentlest farewell he could offer, not because the wounds had disappeared, but because he no longer wanted either of them to remain prisoners of the past. After the call ended, Simone lowered the phone onto the table and looked around the dining room. 3 plates still waited exactly where she had placed them. The candles had nearly burned out, the chicken had gone cold, and the birthday cake remained untouched in the center of the table. She slowly sat down without moving the empty chairs. For the first time, she understood that loneliness had not arrived because a judge had punished her or because someone had chosen revenge. It had grown quietly over many years, each time she placed reputation above honesty, comfort above difficult questions, and personal security above the people who loved her. Relationships built on status had disappeared the moment the status was gone. The only people who might have remained were the ones she had slowly pushed away herself. Outside, the city continued as though nothing had happened. Inside the apartment, 3 untouched meals rested beneath the fading light, telling the story of a family that had once shared everything around the same table. Simone closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to sit with the silence she had spent years trying to outrun, realizing that some consequences were never written into a legal sentence. They simply arrived one ordinary evening when there was no one left to answer the empty chair across the table. Marshall had barely fallen asleep when the smell of smoke drifted through the open window of his small room. At first, he thought someone nearby was burning trash, but seconds later came the sound of shouting from the street. He rushed outside without stopping to put on a jacket. Several people were already running toward the corner where Nadine always parked her food cart. Orange flames climbed into the night sky, swallowing the wooden shelves and the bright yellow awning that had become a familiar sight in the neighborhood. The fire spread so quickly that the heat pushed everyone back. Marshall's heart sank as he realized the cart that had given Nadine and Jolene a future was disappearing in front of his eyes. Without thinking about the danger, he remembered the small metal box hidden beneath the serving counter. Inside were the only 2 things Nadine treasured more than the business itself: her grandmother's recipe and the handwritten note that had changed her life 10 years earlier. Before anyone could stop him, Marshall pulled Eugene's old work gloves over his hands and ran toward the burning cart. Sparks flew through the air as pieces of the roof collapsed behind him. The heat was so intense that it became difficult to breathe, but he forced himself to keep moving until he reached the storage compartment beneath the counter. His gloved hands searched through smoke and twisted metal until they finally touched the familiar steel box. Just as he pulled it free, a burning wooden beam crashed beside him, sending flames across his left arm. The pain shot through his body, but he refused to let go. Firefighters reached him moments later and pulled him away from the cart as the entire structure collapsed into a pile of burning metal and ash. When Marshall looked down, the gloves his father had given him were blackened and torn, yet they had protected his hands long enough for him to save the box. By the time the fire was extinguished, nothing recognizable remained. The fryer had melted into the pavement, the serving window had collapsed inward, and years of hard work had been reduced to smoking debris scattered across the street. Nadine stood silently behind the safety barrier until the firefighters confirmed there was nothing left to save. Then her strength finally gave way. She slowly sank onto the curb, staring at the ashes without blinking. That food cart had never been just a business. It had paid the rent, kept food on the table, and allowed Jolene to dream about college instead of wondering how to survive another month. Every extra dollar she earned had been tucked away for her daughter's education, one small deposit at a time. Looking at the ruins before her, she felt as though 10 years of sacrifice had disappeared in a single night. Tears filled her eyes as she held the rescued metal box against her chest. Perhaps I have carried that promise far enough. Perhaps this is where it ends. Marshall sat beside her despite the fresh bandage already wrapped around his burned arm. He wanted to tell her everything would be all right, but he knew promises meant very little while smoke was still rising from the ashes. Instead, he simply remained there with her until the street grew quiet and the firefighters finished their work. As dawn slowly approached, the neighborhood returned to silence, leaving behind little more than blackened pavement and the smell of burned wood lingering in the cool morning air. When the sun rose a few hours later, Nadine expected to find only the empty space where the cart had once stood. Instead, she saw people arriving from every direction. The owner of a taco stand carried 2 portable gas burners balanced across his shoulders. An elderly couple who sold breakfast pastries unloaded folding tables from the back of an old pickup truck. Another vendor arrived with pots, frying pans, cooking oil, and bags of flour. Someone handed Nadine an envelope containing $10. Another quietly slipped $20 into her hand before walking away. A butcher delivered fresh chicken without asking when he would be paid. A nearby grocery owner stacked vegetables beside the sidewalk and insisted she take everything she needed. None of them were wealthy. Most worked long hours simply to support their own families. Yet, not a single person came empty-handed. They had all remembered the mornings when Nadine had quietly fed someone who could not afford breakfast or stayed open late so a tired worker could still take home a warm meal. Marshall looked around at the growing crowd and felt something that no courtroom victory could ever equal. 10 years earlier, one stranger had believed in Nadine when she had almost lost hope. She had spent the years that followed passing that kindness from one person to another without ever asking for recognition. Now that kindness had returned, multiplied through an entire neighborhood that refused to let her stand alone. He turned toward Nadine, whose eyes were filled with tears for a very different reason than the night before. 10 years ago, you stood again because one stranger believed in you. Today, an entire neighborhood is standing here because you fed them through their hardest days. Before noon, the empty sidewalk had become a construction site powered entirely by generosity. Folding tables were lined together to form a serving counter. A borrowed canopy provided shade. Someone connected a portable propane stove, while others organized utensils, ingredients, and coolers filled with ice. The temporary stall looked nothing like the food cart that had burned, but it was enough to begin again. With trembling hands, Nadine coated the first pieces of chicken in seasoned flour and lowered them into the hot oil. The familiar sound of frying filled the street, followed by the smell that had welcomed thousands of customers over the years. People waiting nearby broke into quiet applause as the first batch turned golden brown. Standing beside her was Marshall, wearing Eugene's worn work gloves despite the burn beneath the bandages. They no longer looked like the gloves of a plumber. They looked like the hands of a man who finally understood that the strongest things people build are not companies or buildings, but the communities willing to rebuild them when everything else has turned to ashes. The verdict arrived on a gray morning that felt strangely ordinary for a day that would close one chapter of so many lives. After months of investigations, testimony, and financial analysis, Vernon was found guilty on multiple federal charges, including fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read, while reporters hurried outside to broadcast the outcome before the hearing had even ended. Investigators had recovered millions of dollars by seizing properties, investment accounts, and luxury assets hidden through shell companies, but the losses stretched far beyond what could ever be recovered. Hundreds of families, investors, and employees had suffered financial damage that no court could fully repair. Marshall was officially recognized as one of the victims rather than the architect of the scheme, and the accusations that had destroyed his reputation were finally lifted. Even so, the restitution payment represented only a small fraction of everything he had once owned. The fortune that had taken decades to build would never return, and for the first time, Marshall realized he no longer measured justice by the size of a bank account. Clarence called that afternoon to tell him the payment had been approved and was ready to be collected. Marshall thanked him quietly, folded the check, and slipped it inside the pocket of his jacket without even looking at the amount. Only minutes later, his phone rang again. This time it was the hospital in Brooklyn. The nurse spoke gently, explaining that Eugene had passed away peacefully in his sleep shortly before sunrise. There had been no pain, no struggle, only a quiet goodbye during the early hours of the morning. Before the call ended, she mentioned one detail that left Marshall unable to speak. When the nurses entered the room, Eugene was still holding a folded newspaper in his hand. Printed across the front page was a photograph of Marshall standing beside Nadine at the temporary food stall, wearing his father's old work gloves while helping serve customers. Beneath the picture was a headline describing how an entire neighborhood had rebuilt the business after the fire. Marshall closed his eyes, realizing his father had spent his final hours seeing the son he had always believed still existed. Later that evening, Marshall unlocked the apartment where Eugene had lived for more than 50 years. Everything remained exactly as it had during their last visit. The old clock still ticked above the stove. The worn kitchen table stood beneath the window, and the familiar smell of coffee and machine oil still lingered in the air. Marshall slowly removed the restitution check from his pocket and placed it on the table where his father had once sorted plumbing receipts after long days of work. The piece of paper represented more money than Eugene had earned in many years, yet standing alone in the quiet apartment, it felt almost meaningless. Marshall looked toward the empty chair by the window, imagining his father sitting there with the same gentle smile that had comforted him since childhood. "I recovered some of the money, Dad, but I arrived too late to tell you that you were never going to lose your home." His voice faded into the silence. No answer came back. The apartment that had always felt alive because of Eugene's quiet presence now seemed impossibly still. Marshall realized that success had finally returned, just enough to prove something his father had known all along. A home was never protected by money alone. It was protected by the people who filled it with love while they still had the chance. The funeral took place a few days later. Neighbors, former co-workers, and people whose lives Eugene had quietly helped over the years gathered to pay their respects. Many of them remembered him not as a master plumber or a hard-working provider, but as the man who always stopped to fix a leaking pipe for an elderly neighbor without charging $1, or stayed late after work to help someone who had nowhere else to turn. Listening to those stories, Marshall understood that his father's greatest legacy had never been the apartment, the savings account, or anything he could leave behind. It was the habit of making other people's burdens a little lighter whenever he had the chance. That lesson had quietly shaped Marshall's own life long before he built his first company, even though it had taken losing everything for him to recognize it again. When the legal process finally ended, financial advisors began contacting Marshall with investment opportunities, business proposals, and plans to rebuild the corporate empire he had once commanded. Some believed he should buy another mansion to replace the one he had lost. Others urged him to return to real estate and prove that his greatest success still lay ahead. Marshall listened politely before declining every offer. The restitution money was enough to begin again, but he no longer wanted to rebuild the life that had once consumed him. Instead, he met with Clarence, Nadine, neighborhood business owners, and several community leaders to discuss a different idea. They imagined a place where street vendors, family restaurants, mechanics, cleaners, and other small business owners could rent affordable space without fearing sudden eviction, hidden fees, or contracts designed to trap them. Lawyers and accountants would volunteer time to explain permits, leases, taxes, and financial documents in language ordinary people could actually understand. It would not make anyone rich overnight, but it might prevent honest workers from losing everything because they trusted the wrong signature or failed to understand the fine print. As Marshall stood outside the empty lot they hoped would one day become that center, he slipped Eugene's worn work gloves back onto his hands. They no longer reminded him of what he had lost. They reminded him of the man who had spent a lifetime building security for other families, one honest job at a time. Marshall smiled quietly, knowing that his next chapter would not be measured by the height of the buildings he owned, but by the number of people who could keep their own doors open because someone had finally chosen to stand beside them before it was too late. The abandoned warehouse stood at the edge of Harlem like a forgotten promise. Broken windows lined the upper floor, rust covered the loading doors, and weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement where delivery trucks had once parked. Most developers saw an expensive demolition project. Marshall saw something different. Every lesson he had learned over the past year seemed to point him toward that neglected building. It was large enough to become more than a business, and practical enough to become something the neighborhood genuinely needed. Using most of the restitution money he had recovered, Marshall purchased the property and immediately began renovations. The old storage rooms were transformed into affordable food stalls where small vendors could finally work without crushing rent. A shared commercial kitchen gave street cooks access to professional equipment they could never have afforded on their own. One section of the building became offices where volunteer lawyers and accountants helped families understand leases, taxes, permits, and financial contracts before signing them. Another floor housed an emergency fund for workers facing sudden hardship, classrooms where children learned basic financial skills, and a handful of temporary rooms reserved for people who had recently lost their homes. The building was no longer designed to make the greatest possible profit. It was designed to make sure honest people were never forced to start over completely alone. As construction neared completion, architects spread the final blueprints across a long table inside the unfinished lobby. The last remaining decision seemed simple. Someone asked what name should appear above the entrance, assuming the project would naturally carry the name of the man who had paid for it. Marshall looked at the drawings for a long moment before quietly writing 4 words across the title page: the Thibodaux Eugene Community Center. Everyone around the table noticed that his own name was missing. Nadine smiled, believing it must be a temporary draft, but when she realized he was serious, she looked at him with genuine surprise. "You are paying for the building, yet you are not putting your name on it." Marshall rested a hand on the blueprint and glanced around the empty hall that would soon be filled with people searching for another chance. Years earlier, he would have welcomed the opportunity to see his name carved into another building. Back then, he believed success was measured by recognition. Losing everything had taught him that buildings were remembered not because of the names engraved above the doors, but because of the lives changed inside them. "I spent most of my life placing my name on buildings. This time, I want the names of the people who taught me why buildings matter." Nadine lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the answer. Her family name stood beside Eugene's because one had shown Marshall how kindness could change a stranger's future, while the other had taught him that love mattered more than property, wealth, or reputation. Together, those 2 names told the true story of the building far better than his own ever could. As workers installed the large steel letters above the entrance later that afternoon, Marshall felt a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he had created something without caring whether anyone remembered who had paid for it. A few weeks later, another reason to celebrate arrived. Jolene rushed into the center, carrying a large envelope with trembling hands, barely able to catch her breath before finding her mother. Nadine looked at the university seal and immediately understood what it meant. Jolene had been accepted into a biology program, fulfilling the dream she had carried since childhood. Tucked inside the acceptance package was another letter announcing that she had also been awarded the first scholarship funded by the new community center, created specifically for the children of hard-working families determined to build a better future. Tears filled Nadine's eyes before she could finish reading. Every early morning, every long shift at the food cart, and every sacrifice suddenly felt worthwhile. Jolene wrapped her arms around her mother and held on tightly. "I want to learn how to save lives, the way you did, only I will be wearing a white coat." Nadine laughed through her tears, remembering the frightened little girl who had once pretended not to be hungry so her mother could eat instead. Now that same child was preparing to help people in a completely different way, carrying forward the compassion that had shaped her entire life. Marshall watched them from across the room, realizing that the greatest return on any investment could never be measured on a financial statement. Sometimes it looked like a daughter becoming the woman her mother had quietly hoped she would be. On the morning of the community center's grand opening, neighbors filled every hallway long before the ribbon was cut. Food vendors prepared their first meals inside the shared kitchen, children explored the classrooms, and volunteers welcomed families into offices where they could receive advice without fear of hidden costs or confusing legal language. Near the entrance stood a simple glass display that attracted almost every visitor. Inside rested two ordinary pieces of paper. One was Nadine's grandmother's handwritten fried chicken recipe, stained by years of use. The other was the note Marshall had written a decade earlier, the few words that had encouraged a struggling mother to believe her future was not over. Together, those fragile pages had survived hurricanes, fire, betrayal, and the passing of time. Beneath the display, a single sentence was engraved into a bronze plaque for every visitor to read. Kindness completes its journey only when it is passed forward. Marshall paused in front of the display before the opening ceremony began. He smiled quietly, realizing that the greatest legacy he would ever leave behind was not the building surrounding him. It was the simple truth preserved inside that glass case, waiting to inspire the next stranger who walked through the door believing that one act of kindness could never be enough. The grand opening of the Thibodaux-Eugene Community Center began long before sunrise. By 7 o'clock, families were already lining up outside the entrance, filling the sidewalks with conversations, laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the shared kitchen. Children hurried toward the classrooms where free financial workshops would be held later that morning, while food vendors arranged their stalls beneath bright new signs bearing their own names instead of expensive franchise logos. Volunteers guided elderly visitors through the building, helping them find legal clinics, housing counselors, and community resources. Reporters arrived, hoping to interview the man whose remarkable rise, devastating fall, and unexpected redemption had become national news. They searched for Marshall near the entrance, expecting to find him standing behind a podium or preparing to cut the ceremonial ribbon. Instead, they found only an empty chair placed quietly beside the front doors. Resting across its seat were Eugene's old plumbing gloves, carefully folded beneath the morning light. It was the only tribute Marshall believed his father would have wanted. Marshall himself was nowhere near the stage. He stood inside the kitchen wearing a faded apron, his sleeves rolled above healing burns that had almost disappeared. Oil crackled inside the fryer, while volunteers hurried trays of food toward waiting customers. Orders were called from every direction, timers rang without stopping, and laughter echoed through the room as people worked shoulder to shoulder. Marshall moved calmly through the rush, seasoning chicken, checking temperatures, and helping new vendors who were still learning the equipment. Months earlier, he had overseen billion-dollar construction projects from polished boardrooms. Today, he measured success by whether every family left with a warm meal and the feeling that they belonged. Looking around the busy kitchen, he realized he had never felt more certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Late that morning, as another wave of customers entered the building, the kitchen door opened quietly. Marshall glanced up for only a second before returning to the fryer. Standing near the entrance was Dorian, dressed in simple work clothes instead of the tailored suits he had once worn. Since testifying during the investigation, the family trust had been dissolved, and the inheritance he had expected for most of his life had disappeared. He had taken an ordinary job, rented a modest apartment, and begun rebuilding his future one paycheck at a time. The change had not been easy, but it had given him something wealth never had, a chance to discover who he was without someone else's money deciding his path. He looked around the busy kitchen, smiled nervously, and reached for one of the spare aprons hanging on the wall. Without asking permission or announcing himself, he tied it around his waist and quietly stepped forward. Marshall did not ask why his son had come. He did not ask how long he planned to stay or whether this was only a visit. Instead, he reached toward the counter, picked up a pair of stainless steel kitchen tongs, and held them out. It was the same quiet kind of invitation that had once changed Nadine's life and, more recently, had begun repairing his own. There was no dramatic speech, no emotional embrace, and no attempt to erase the years they had lost. Some relationships were rebuilt the same way honest work was done, one small task at a time. The first batch burns easily. Do not rush. Dorian accepted the tongs with a smile that carried equal parts gratitude and regret. He stepped beside his father as another tray of seasoned chicken waited to be lowered into the hot oil. The kitchen grew louder as customers continued placing orders, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with explanations about the past. Just stay beside me, Dad. This time, I will not walk away. Marshall nodded once, and together they lowered the first pieces of chicken into the fryer. The oil hissed loudly as steam rose into the warm kitchen air. Trays moved from one station to another, volunteers carried meals toward waiting families, and children laughed somewhere beyond the serving counter. Father and son worked side by side without needing another conversation. Every order they completed together quietly replaced one more memory of distance with a new memory of trust. Healing, Marshall realized, rarely arrived all at once. More often, it sounded like the rhythm of shared work performed by two people finally moving in the same direction. As the afternoon faded into evening, the lines slowly disappeared and the kitchen finally grew quiet. Only one meal remained. Just as the volunteers began cleaning the counters, an older homeless man stopped outside the entrance and hesitated before approaching the serving window. Embarrassment showed on his face as he quietly asked how much a meal cost, already reaching into his pocket for a handful of loose coins that clearly would not be enough. Marshall looked at the final plate, then gently placed it into the man's hands without accepting a single dollar. The gesture reminded Nadine of another afternoon many years earlier when someone had quietly seen a hungry child without making her feel ashamed. You do not have to pay today. When you are standing again, help someone else who is about to fall. The man looked down at the meal, unable to speak for a moment before quietly thanking him and walking away. Behind the counter, Nadine heard every word. Her eyes drifted toward the glass display near the entrance, where her grandmother's recipe rested beside the faded handwritten note that had survived storms, fire, and the passing of time. She smiled softly, realizing the promise written on that piece of paper had completed another journey. Kindness had once again moved from one life into another without asking for recognition. After the doors were locked and the last lights in the hallway were dimmed, the four of them gathered around the kitchen table inside the community center. Nadine served the leftover food, Jolene talked excitedly about her upcoming biology classes, and Dorian laughed while admitting he still had a lot to learn about frying chicken without burning it. Marshall listened more than he spoke, grateful for the ordinary sounds filling the room. None of them had recovered the lives they once imagined they would have. Eugene was gone. The company would never return. Lost years could not be reclaimed. Yet around that simple table, none of those things mattered. No one had to prove they were wealthy, successful, or important before being welcome to sit down. They belonged because they had chosen to remain when life became difficult. Marshall looked around the table one last time before the lights were switched off. He remembered the man he had been when he believed success could protect him from loss, and he thought about the frightened stranger who had first walked into Nadine's life carrying more money than wisdom. The journey between those two versions of himself had been painful, but it had led him somewhere far more valuable than the life he once chased. Marshall once believed that losing everything meant discovering that the room was empty. In the end, he understood that losing everything merely made the room quiet enough for him to notice who was still standing in the doorway.